Good morning, everybody. Welcome at this defense session. Hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Laura Kirsch will defend the academic thesis CEO Responsible Leadership, Exploration, Measurement and Impact. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you. Dear Prorector, dear supervisors, dear members of the Defense Committee and dear audience online and on-site, welcome to my public defense on the topic CEO Responsible Leadership, Exploration, Measurement and Impact. We have all seen the news. Time and again, corporations and their top-level leaders are involved in major scandals and are increasingly held accountable for them in court. For example, we've seen the ongoing trials against the former CEO of Volkswagen over the diesel emission cheating scandal and against the former CEO of Wirecard for major accounting fraud. Moreover, we've seen the landmark ruling on institutional moral harassment at France Telecom. And we see that these scandals do not only pertain to established firms, but also to startups, as is evident in the case of Theranos, which deceived investors and customers. However, on the other hand, we see that both corporations and their leaders increasingly acknowledge their role in society. For example, in 2017, the World Economic Forum in Davos had the theme Responsive and Responsible Leadership. In 2019, the Business Roundtable, a group of US-American CEOs, signed the statement on the purpose of the corporation to signal a departure from shareholder primacy to an inclusion of all stakeholders. And lastly, in his annual letters to CEOs, Larry Fink, the CEO of the biggest asset management company in the world, asked CEOs to strive for long-term value and to actively voice their thoughts on important societal issues. So all of these initiatives show that the responsibility of corporations and their leaders is becoming more and more important. And this brings us to the gap which we have in research, because on the company side, we have a long-standing research tradition under the term corporate social responsibility. However, if we look at the individual side, so the type of leadership required, this field is much newer and recently emerged under the name responsible leadership. So what exactly is responsible leadership? Let's take a step back and define it. Responsible leadership has been defined in a seminal article by Mark and Pless as a relational and ethical phenomenon which occurs in social processes of interaction between those who lead and those who are led. And more recently, it has been refined as an orientation or mindset taken by people in executive level positions towards meeting the needs of a firm's stakeholders. With these definitions, responsible leadership is distinct from other leadership styles in three meaningful ways. So first of all, it goes beyond the leader-follower diet to an inclusion of all stakeholders. Secondly, it is most meaningful at the upper echelons level of the firm. And lastly, it refers to a mindset. So, we see that since its emergence in 2006, responsible leadership research has been gaining traction. For example, several conferences have been devoted to the theme. Moreover, we see a growing interest of responsible leadership, especially vis-à-vis other more established leadership theories. And lastly, we see an uptake of publications in top-tier journals. So after defining responsible leadership and showing its growing relevance, let's have a look at what this dissertation wants to add to the field. This dissertation is devoted to three interlinked research questions, each addressed in one chapter. So, in the second chapter of this dissertation, we ask, what is the current state of quantitative research on responsible leadership? And we answer this question by undertaking a systematic literature review. Second, In the next chapter, we ask how can CEO responsible leadership be measured using a novel instrument? And to this end, we develop and validate such an instrument. Then, lastly, we ask what are the social and economic consequences of CEO responsible leadership on the firm level. So let's dive into the second chapter of this dissertation. We first undertook a systematic literature review searching for the terms responsible leadership and responsible leader. As is evident from our search, we see a strong increase of attention, research attention, especially the quantitative inquiry has seen an immense growth in the recent years. Thus, we focus on this line of inquiry, which we summarize into an overall framework, and we identify major gaps in extant research. Our framework consists of antecedents, mediators, moderators, and outcomes of responsible leadership. And our findings show several things. First of all, outcomes are the most researched variable of our framework, followed by mediators. However, what is researched much less are antecedents and moderators of responsible leadership. And lastly, beyond these variables, we also see that there's a problem with how responsible leadership is addressed in these studies itself. And this problem pertains to two measurement concerns. The first one is that responsible leadership is usually measured by using supervisors, and it is also measured by using surveys. And these two measurement concerns directly translate back into our framework because of the outcome category as the most studied variable, we see that most outcomes studied are actually on the micro level. So for example, employee satisfaction, turnover, and so on. So, but meso and macro level variables have been studied much less. Why? Because it is difficult to address those variables using supervisors and surveys. So we see several gaps in extant research, of which we address 3 in the coming chapters. So first of all, we see a problem with the measurement level. Secondly, we see a problem with the measurement instrument. And lastly, we see a limited understanding which we have on meso and macro level outcomes. So this brings us directly to our third chapter of the dissertation, because here we wanted to move the measurement of responsible leadership from the supervisory level to the top level. However, as the literature review showed, the predominant mode of measuring responsible leadership currently is using surveys. And we have a problem here because surveys cannot easily be applied to studying top executives. Why not? Because we do not have access to them usually, and they're usually also not really willing to participate. So we needed a new approach here. And this new approach consisted in relying on upper echelons theory as the study of top executives. And this gave us access to a new methodological toolbox, which is named Computer-Aided Text Analysis, and consists in developing keyword dictionaries which can then be applied to texts of top executives. So the purpose of this study was to develop a dictionary of CEO responsible leadership. And we do so by engaging in a 4-step process. In our first study, we develop a deductive version of our dictionary. And we do so by searching general thesauri and dictionaries for the terms responsible and responsibility. And then we let 10 international experts rate those words if they actually fit responsible leadership or not. Next, we set out to validate our dictionary, first by comparing it to a human coding. And we only find tentative convergent validity, which is why we test further. And in the next study, we compare our dictionary to other established dictionaries of, from the field of ethics and morals and specifically developed for CEOs. And we find good convergent and discriminant validity. lastly, we engaged in a fourth study in which we wanted to understand the predictive validity of a dictionary by using machine learning. And we use machine learning for two purposes here. The first one is to inductively let algorithms generate words which responsible CEOs use in practice. And then we screen those words and we add them if they fit to our dictionary. And then we examine if the deductive and the combined dictionary can accurately distinguish between responsible and irresponsible CEOs. And we find that that is the case. In our fourth chapter, we wanted to comprehend the effect of CEO responsible leadership on outcomes. And we wanted to understand how context variables influence this relationship. So, more specifically, our developed and validated dictionary from the previous study now allows us to go beyond the micro-level outcomes. And since CEOs have been shown time and again that they impact firm-level outcomes, we focus on these. To this end, we connected CEO responsible leadership to two outcome variables which have been shown to be largely influenced by CEOs, which are corporate social responsibility and financial performance. To do so, we constructed a sample of international firms from 16 countries. We collected their letters to shareholders, and we applied our new developed measure to those letters and connected them with secondary data using panel regression. Our findings show that CEO responsible leadership actually positively influences corporate social responsibility. However, if we dissect corporate social responsibility, only the social pillar, not the environmental pillar, is impacted. Then we also find that CEO responsible leadership positively impacts firm financial performance. If we now turn to the context variables, we see that the relationship between CEO responsible leadership and corporate social responsibility is stronger during crisis. Moreover, we see that the relationship between CEO responsible leadership and financial performance is weaker given certain cultural variables, and it is stronger if a CEO has more discretion in an industry. Wrapping up this dissertation, we can make 3 conclusions based on each chapter. First, we see that quantitative research on responsible leadership is growing, but it required a novel instrument for the CEO level. Next, we see with our novel instrument that we can actually measure CEO responsible leadership unobtrusively, and we can identify responsible CEOs by their words. And lastly, responsible CEOs have a positive impact on firm financial and non-financial outcomes. Thank you for your attention. I hand now over to the prorector.
Thank you for your presentation. So now we move to the opposition. The opposition will be opened by Rob Bauer, who is Professor of Sustainable Finance and Corporate Governance here at Maastricht University, and who is Chair of the Assessment Committee. The floor is yours.
Dear candidate, dear Laura, I have the honor and the pleasure to be the first to congratulate you with a very well-written thesis. I love to read it. It is an important and very timely topic as well, responsible leadership. So it was also a pleasure to read it because it let me think about things that I've been in contact with in the past years as well. And I saw you just mention Larry Fink claiming that there should be responsible leadership. And if there, in my opinion, in a financial world is a leader that may not be so responsible, it is Larry Fink in my view. But that is a different topic and maybe for the reception. And we are in very turbulent times, so it's an important topic to talk about this. So I'm not a specialist in the responsible leadership literature. So I got maybe some views that you may not expect. And I immediately wondered, what exactly is it? So what is responsible leadership? And if you ask this question in different parts of the world, you will get different answers because of legal context, preferences, beliefs that differ. And I think you take that into account in some of your chapters as well. So in our Western European context, we might associate responsible leadership in the corporate context with CEOs that act and speak like Paul Polman, Emmanuel Faber, Unilever and Danone, both being sacked more or less because US shareholders didn't like their responsible leadership style for financial reasons. Whereas in the US, people like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, because they bring this innovation and the financial gains that come with it. Interestingly, and I mentioned this to you and I gave my feedback, in the 1940s, the CEO of US Steel said, non-executive directors, they are the parsley on the fish, decorative but not useful. That was the historical time frame back then, how people thought, and that was a hero back then. This was the hero of the 1940s of US Steel. Anyway, when an experienced manager is appointed as a CEO, he will be impacted by the context the organization is in, the culture of the company as it was, the legal context. Look at the EU Green Deal versus the US legislation in this context, makes a big difference. Industry habits, especially the shareholder base. Is the shareholder base dispersed or concentrated? Is it US, like many Dutch companies are held 30 to 40% by US investors, makes a huge impact on which CEO in the end is selected. So that is endogenous. And that I just wonder, when the shareholders have a lot of decision and steering power, and also the non-executive directors in the corporation, and especially in the Rhineland model that we have in the Netherlands and, for instance, Germany, they have a big role in selecting the CEO. So I can take all the other stakeholders in, but my first question is, whose responsible leadership are you actually measuring here? Is it the ones of the CEOs, or is it exactly of those that choose the CEO? Then I have a second question, so let me continue and then you can answer them. It's just two very simple questions. The first one was, whose responsible leadership are you actually measuring? Then it strikes me that when you refer also in your presentation on the literature review, that you have a quite narrow focus on journals. The literature list you mention, or the journal list that you mention on page 32, where antecedents of leaders have been studied in recent years, is quite small. And it has been studied, for instance, in my field, finance, quite extensively in the past years. Next to that, the finance journals actually are very critical on the CSR literature that is being published in the Journal of Business Ethics, and all the inferences are being made out of those results. So I think that is something you should maybe also have a look at. But in this context, the Review of Financial Studies published an article by somebody I really know well, Mr. Duchin in Toronto and other universities. And the title is The Origins and Real Effects of the Gender Gap, Evidence from CEOs' Formative Years. And it shows that male CEOs allocate more investment capital to male division managers than female division managers. And why is that? Because especially those CEOs who grew up in male-dominated families, where the father was the only income earner and had more education than the mother, they did that. And it was also if they went to all-male high schools, etc. So these antecedents have been studied in the finance literature of all places, and they are not in your literature overview. Yeah. So my point is, responsible leadership has many dimensions, and I think those financial journals that I mentioned could maybe add to your dictionary. So my second question is, how could a broader literature review, maybe even beyond finance, eventually have added to the quality and breadth of your dictionary, and hence impact your results in the 4 studies of Chapter 3?
Yeah. Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and your questions, which I will try to untangle now. So to your first question, whose responsibility are we actually measuring? So first of all, let's go back to the definition of responsible leadership. And yes, there are many out there. We rely on the seminal definition by Mark and Pless, because that's the one which has been cited most often. But there are different definitions out there, and depending on these definitions, you would probably also get different results. So then the selection process of a CEO. Whose responsibility are we actually measuring? So if we look at the data that we used letters to shareholders. And there's also discussion around letters to shareholders. Who writes that letter? Is it the CEO? Is it the top management team? Is it the press department? So there's also a discussion around authorship on this. However, when it comes to the selection of CEOs, we're actually not testing for this. This is because this is an endogenous variable, and we would have to test for endogeneity here, which is a plan for future research. Okay. So you're hitting a mark here, but we have not tested for it in the current version of the dissertation, because there might, as you said, there might be several factors that influence who actually gets to be CEO. Yeah. And then to your second question, so we also relied on the definition by Mark and Pless for the literature study, which mainly comes up in leadership journals, in CSR journals, and so on. I've looked into the references you provided regarding the finance field, and the big difference that I notice is that with our dictionary, we're measuring a mindset. And in leadership research, there's a distinction between mindset and behavior. And what I see in these finance journals is that they focus on actual behavior. So for example, leverage ratios, cash allocation, and so on. And we are not trying to capture this with our dictionary, because we are measuring the mindset of a CEO. And if that is consequential, is something we look into the fourth chapter. So if it actually has an impact on CSR firm performance. But it is not something that is in this dissertation, because we focus on this mindset goal. And regarding these, the Duchin and I think the Bernal papers, there are antecedents which shape this responsible leadership behavior, but that doesn't, so it would have to be tested if that also shapes the mindset of a CEO.
So you could have taken them into account or not? Is that what are you saying now?
In the current version, no, because we focus on Mark and Pless definition. So we had to draw a boundary for the literature study. But of course, it would be very valuable to have a broader and more multidisciplinary review of responsible leadership. But given the definition we used, and also that we already find 9 different conceptualizations of responsible leadership and 14 different measurement instruments, this would have probably added to the plurality and would have maybe called into question the generalizability of what we find.
Okay. Well, you convinced me for now, but I'll come back to you in the second round.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by the second member of the assessment committee, which is Professor Dr. Nicola Pless, and she joins us from the Positive Business Institute at the University of South Australia online. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you for giving the overview and the thesis with your outcomes. My question would pertain to the methodological approach. So you have chosen to construct dictionaries. Now, why did you choose that particular approach, where you focus on words, in contrast to, for instance, taking a longer speech that may perhaps also not only address shareholders, but a broader range of stakeholders?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question, which pertains to the methodological approach and why we've chosen it, and how to enlarge our methodology. So let me first get back to why we've chosen this methodological approach. We wanted to study responsible leadership at the CEO level. And dictionaries are a very classical and handy instrument because you cannot get access to those CEOs. And dictionaries circumvent this need of having intrusive access. And they can be readily applied to, for example, letters to shareholders would be one thing, which we did. However, it could also be applied to, for example, earnings call transcripts. So all texts that are utterances of a CEO. And we chose this approach because it has one very big advantage over, for example, using speech tagging or whole paragraphs or whole sentences, because it's replicable. So it can be used by future research to engage in further studies, to retest what we have found, to maybe test it on some of the variables that have shown inconclusive results in the literature study. Because a dictionary, as opposed to these other language-based approaches, which have their advantages as well, but a dictionary has this big advantage of replicability. So this is why we chose it, and because it is a classical instrument in upper echelon theory. And if I do recall correctly, your most recent research also focused on CEOs and how they show responsible leadership. So, and therefore we wanted to make a step forward into this, how CEOs actually show responsible leadership. And then regarding the inclusion of other texts, for example, from other stakeholders, I actually first collected the interviews you mentioned in your 2012 study, and we subjected them to our machine learning algorithms, but we quickly noticed that they are not as homogeneous as the letters to shareholders, because letters to shareholders have a very particular context. So they are there to address the shareholders, so they have a very structured format, and it's not easy for a CEO to deviate from that format. However, the interviews, for example, have a large variety. I can name two examples. So Anita Roddick, for example, in her interviews, she stresses responsible leadership all the time. She goes through those roles, basically. She has these environmental protection, human rights issues on top of her head all the time. However, if you, for example, look at Nestlé, Peter Brabeck-Mate, he is much more oriented towards shareholders. So he always stresses firm performance, he stresses shareholder return. And we quickly noticed that this type of data is too heterogeneous and gives us too much variety to develop a dictionary with words that matter for all, basically. However, we could also apply our instrument to texts of, for example, employees, to employee ratings, for example, if these words appear, because I've seen that, I think that's a study we mentioned by Gupta et al. 2018. They applied their measure of CEO political ideology then later on to employees to see the same, if the fit between CEOs and employees actually affects firm outcomes. So our measure could also be applied or screened by using, for example, ratings on platforms like Kununu or so on to screen for how employees actually feel about this. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Annelies Renders, who is the third member of the assessment committee. Professor Renders is a professor of accounting and operations management, and she joins us online from BI Norway. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, unfortunately, I can't turn on my video, so it will be without video. So dear PhD candidate, dear Laura, I would like to congratulate you first with finishing your dissertation. And I think it's a very nice piece of work, and it addresses many interesting questions. But however, today my job is not only to applaud you with your work, but also to ask a question. And so here's my question, and it relates to chapter 3. So in this chapter, you use 4 different studies to develop and validate a new measure to classify CEOs as responsible leaders. And in a nutshell, you devise a dictionary of words that are related with responsible leadership. And then you apply this dictionary to the letter to shareholders written by a sample of responsible and irresponsible CEOs. And then in the next step, you use this training sample to train your classifiers and then test the accuracy on a testing sample. And I have two questions related to this. First of all, you use a sample of letters to shareholders. And we all know that shareholders are like a specific set or specific type of stakeholders in a firm, right? And so this was also kind of addressed already by Professor Bauer. They're typically interested in the financial performance and the future outlook of a company. And so I can imagine that the words that the CEOs use in this letter might be tailored specifically to that audience, right? And it's also what you just said in one of your answers, that these letters are very homogeneous and have a kind of specific structured format, right? But you also say in your dissertation that responsible leadership is about more than just the shareholders, right? It's taking into account other stakeholders, taking into account your responsibility towards society. So can you reflect on how using only a sample of letters to shareholders might influence or even bias your findings? Second, your training and testing sample consists of letters to shareholders of the same CEOs. And you kind of randomly assign letters to the training sample and to the testing sample. Now, we know from prior accounting literature that CEOs have a personal disclosure style. And so you find that when you train your classifiers and you apply them to the testing sample, that it kind of accurately predicts who is a responsible CEO and who isn't, right? Now, can you reflect on the extent to which this might be driven by this personal CEO style? Because your samples are not very independent, right? Your training sample and your testing sample consist of similar or the same CEOs. Okay? So can you reflect on how this might influence the accuracy that you find? And would it not have been better to maybe exclude some of the CEOs from your training sample and to use them as an independent test sample? I look forward to your answers.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and your questions. So let me briefly summarize or try to rephrase the first question. So why are letters to shareholders an appropriate source for our dictionary? As I said before, letters to shareholders offer a great deal of that they are formal texts, they have a very similar style. And we also saw that in those letters, there is sufficient variation within the formal structure. For example, some of the letters to shareholders are also in the meantime not called letters to shareholders. That's what we say as a terminology. But for example, they address dear stakeholders or to all our stakeholders. So the audience, the primary audience, you're absolutely right, is the shareholder, but they address a broader spectrum, and that's why they also have been used, I think, by upper echelons research for example, measuring narcissism, for measuring hubris, and then link it to corporate social responsibility. So the primary addressee here is the shareholder, but it's more about or there are other stakeholders which are addressed in this letter as well. And we quite frankly, we saw that in the letters of those 44 leaders. And then your second question, I would have a follow-up question here. So the personal CEO style, could you define a bit more what you mean by that?
It's just that if you see consecutive letters of the same CEO, that there's like a personal style, a personal use of words in those letters. And so this would, if you would pick up those, it would help you predict, obviously, the next letter to the shareholder.
All right, I have not thought about this, to be quite honest, but yes, there will be. So from upper echelons research, we know that the style of the CEO actually influences the letter, and that is also an argument why the CEO writes the letter and not the press department and not the top management team. So yes, there could be an influence of the personal style of the CEO. We have not covered that in the dissertation, I would say. But what you could do is gather additional variables that could influence the CEO style. For example, antecedents, which Professor Bauer just mentioned, like where have your socio-economic background, where you've been raised, US versus a European context, and so on. So, but in the current version of the dissertation, I don't think we control for that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Jos Lemming, who is Professor of Marketing and Service Innovation here at Maastricht University and also a member of the assessment committee.
Okay, dear candidate, congratulations with your nice thesis, easy to read and very informative. I learned a lot as well, so thank you very much. Of course, I have a couple of questions, and these questions, they stem from some thoughts that I had when reading your, for instance, to start with, your literature study. If you look at your literature study, in my opinion, and after a first read, I would think that it's very limited. The number of words, the typical words, and this leads to a, in my opinion, rather narrow set of articles. Responsible behavior is indeed very much a type of behavior of leaders. On the other hand, the behavior will manifest itself in various decisions regarding the wide range of different dimensions in corporate social responsibility. In other words, there's more to it. And when I see this lineup of words and topics, and then of course you did some interesting things to make it more elaborate, right? To take a second step. Could you convince me that your approach covers the relevant words and issues and also then the relevant literature?
Okay. Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and your question, which pertains to the literature study and how this trickles down, these decisions from the literature study trickle down throughout the dissertation. So we based the literature study and the starting year of the literature study on the seminal article by Mark and Pless, which yielded the terms responsible leader and responsible leadership. This was a choice which for two reasons. First of all, because otherwise we would have created confusion around the construct, and construct proliferation is one of the big issues in leadership research. So we purposefully did not include, for example, ethical leadership, or which you could also, because these are adjacent topics, which you could also include. But we focused on this definition to have articles in our literature study that all at least try to measure the same thing. And that's why we chose such a limited set of terms. How to broaden the literature study could be, for example, to also include qualitative articles and mixed method studies, which we have included currently. But it is really about this definition, and that we needed to try to have a comparability of studies in here. And how this affects, so when you said responsible leader behavior, we saw, or in recent years, responsible leadership has been defined as a mindset. So it's not a behavior in itself. It doesn't manifest in, for example, financial decisions in itself, but it's a mindset. And let me give you a couple of other examples from upper echelons research. They, for example, use CEO attention to a specific technology, CEO hubris, CEO narcissism, entrepreneurial orientation, and these, they do not try to capture behavior. And because a dictionary is not suitable to capture behavior. And because we wanted to stay consistent with this approach that is a mindset throughout all the studies, we decided to not broaden the literature review, because it would have been, then chapter 1 would have been inconsistent with the rest of the dissertation.
Okay, this explains partly what I was asking. I just want to bring it to sort of a next level of a concrete discussion, and that's about LTS, letter to shareholders. So you were talking about the mindset, that is clear, and you think or you assume that the letter to the shareholders would contain this mindset.
Yeah.
But isn't it the case that also that not only shareholders but also other stakeholders form their opinions, have a sort of an idea of the mindset of the leaders and the leadership that is also very important to explain results? For instance, customer reviews. So that's my background is marketing. So obviously I'm concerned also with the point of view of customers, not only shareholders, but also regular customers, customer groups, the general public, general opinion, journalists, newspapers, newspaper articles. So this is more the eye of the beholder, right? So the eye of the beholder also contains a lot of interesting and also helpful information, in my opinion, about the mindset of responsible leaders. Or am I stretching this too far?
Okay, so let me get back to what you said about letters to shareholders. They address primarily shareholders, but they are also targeted, if you read through them, towards a broader audience. It is not the double check with how customers then perceive or other stakeholders like NGOs, or you could also use stock analysts or whomever perceives how the letter or how they react to the letter, if they, for example, believe that this is credible. So we see the based on strategy research, letters to shareholders have been widely used to study mindset, to study cognition. This is based on the Worf-Sapir hypothesis that the words you use are related to the concepts you have in mind. And this has been widely used in strategy research, but it only goes to the mindset of the CEO. It never goes one step further to say, like, how is this perceived by the stakeholders? So I'm willing to concede a little bit, but I think you're stretching it too far. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Pim Martens, who is Professor of Planetary Health here at Maastricht University, and he's also a member of the assessment committee. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear candidate, congratulations with your thesis. Also congratulations to the promoters. I read it with great interest, and while I was reading it, I was thinking about a quote by Gus Path. You may know him, an American environmental lawyer. And I just want to use this quote to introduce my question. So he says, and I quote, "I used to think that the top environmental problems were climate change and biodiversity loss, and that good science could solve this. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And for this, we need transformational changes. And we as scientists do not know how to deal with this." And while reading your thesis, I think, well, hey, wait a minute, that's not correct, because I think your thesis, your work, at least makes an attempt to deal with this, so to put in the minds and to see what responsible leadership can contribute to the needed change. We need to resolve these global environmental issues. So, being Professor of Planetary Health, you may understand that I will like to take up your approach maybe one step higher, because looking at the increasing importance of these global challenges, like climate change, as already mentioned, how do you see the role of CEO responsible leadership in advancing those principles, so the principles of planetary health? Do you think that your framework can also be used or maybe slightly modified to encourage corporate actions to also promote planetary health, so address long-term, far-away issues that relate to environmental change? Or is your framework not adapted to that yet? And if not, how would you then proceed from there?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and your question, which I think is basically two sub-questions, because first you're going back to your quote, greed, selfishness, and so on. They have been actually studied by upper echelon researchers a lot. And so our dictionary is actually a juxtaposition of that, because we study something that is positive, which comes of CEOs. And so, or can be something positive. So our dictionary can actually be used, and this brings me to your second question, to scan for CEOs which have this certain mindset of responsible leadership. So, and that could be, for example, when selecting a responsible CEO, and how this translates into firm outcomes. And these firm outcomes could also, in a further step, when adapting the framework, be used to address the SDGs. For example, or for example, one could check if a responsible CEO addresses more SDGs than a less responsible CEO. So to answer your question, yeah, it could be used in a further step. I'm not an expert on planetary health, but it could be extended to, of course, other outcomes. And that's one of the aims we had with the dictionary, was that we have a handy tool by which we can scan CEOs if they are responsible. And so yes, it could be, and hopefully it will be extended to other outcomes in future research.
Yeah. And how would you then, because then I would be interested to have the planet as a stakeholder, for example. Yeah. So how would you then do that, make the transformation from your current dictionary and approach to include also the planet Earth as a stakeholder? Because you mentioned in your conclusions in chapter 4 that you don't see any straight positive effect on the environmental pillar of the corporate social responsibility. You see it on the others, social dimension and the economical one. So, and I'm thinking maybe that's also because it's probably too narrow defined, the environmental pillar of your approach. So how would you then take that planetary approach?
So if we go back to chapter 4, we actually see that the dictionary only impacts the social pillar strongly, but it does not significantly impact the environmental pillar, which was also a surprising finding. But this goes back, so if the Earth is represented by, for example, non-governmental organizations, institutions like the United Nations, you could also use the dictionary to scan those documents. That's why it's so handy, or to examine how those institutions react. And that brings me back to Professor Lemming, react to other stakeholders and how they view then a responsible CEO.
Looking forward to that extension of your research, because I think it will be very valuable. So thanks a lot.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Jia Li, who is affiliated with the Organizational Behavior Institute at the Rotterdam School of Management. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Dear candidate, dear Laura, thank you very much for this interesting piece. So I'm always interested in interdisciplinary research combining organizational behavior and also with strategy, basically. So my first question is regarding your chapter 2. So in chapter 2, you did a very nice literature review, and you have a very nice multi-level theoretical framework, right? But your definition of responsible leadership is actually quite narrow. It's specifically about executive or top management responsible leadership. So I'm just wondering whether you can broaden the definition a little bit more to consider itself as a multi-level construct. Because if you think about your theoretical framework, those mediators, those outcome variables, a lot of them, they are at individual level. They are about employees,
job attitude and also job outcomes. So they don't necessarily have the direct interactions with top executives, right? So if you define responsible leadership at only top level, and what is the mechanism that can translate this responsible leadership at the top level to influence normal, employees' behaviors? So this is my first question. And if we still have time, my second question is regarding your chapter 4, which is also very interesting, especially all these moderating effects, right? So I'm just wondering, it is out of curiosity type of question. Can it be any theoretical or overarching theoretical mechanism that explain the overall moderating effects? Because all these four moderators, like institutional collectivism, power distance, seems to be quite scattered. So I'm just wondering, according to you, whether there's some overarching, coherent mechanism that can give us some interesting insight regarding these moderating effects.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and your question. So I would first start with your first question regarding chapter 2, the literature study. So we have named these two definitions by Mark and Pless, as well as Waldman, because they show that there's still definitional quarrel around responsible leadership. And we see that in the very beginning, because of the more broad definition of Mark and Pless, we see that most of the studies were based on the supervisor level. So they examined supervisor responsible leadership and linked it to something, usually an employee outcome. So there's actually, while we, and then later on came the shift to CEO responsible leadership. And we speculate why that's happening, probably because the CEO socio-political activism literature is growing, which sees that CEOs should take a stand, and maybe statements like Larry Fink's also propel this transition. But we see that while it is probably most meaningful at the upper echelon level, there's also a very big part to take on the supervisor middle management level. So this is the definition is something that you can stretch to the top level, but also to the supervisor level. And then regarding your chapter 4, so the moderating effect that explains all of this, the overarching, and this is also a connection to your first question, because we see in the mediating and moderating variables that there's a lot of there are institutional and organizational level variables which moderate or mediate this effect. We've seen both in the literature study, and we've done in chapter 4, we've done moderating variables which can strengthen or weaken this effect. And the overall mechanism would probably that, based on strategy research again, that CEOs are constrained by the context in which they operate. And this context can be the organization, but it can also be an institutional context. For example, CEOs have been shown to, when they are abroad, to adapt to certain cultural expectations. So for example, in chapter 4, we use the globe studies as a moderating variable, and the globe studies are based on culturally implicit leadership theory. And this shows that leaders actually adapt to the expectations of a country's culture. And so there might be, I don't think there will be one overarching mechanism, but basically this adaptation effect of CEOs on the context in which they are embedded would probably explain most of the moderating variables.
Okay, thank you.
So this concludes the first round of questioning, and we still have time for at least to start a second round, and I would like to invite Professor Bauer to ask another question.
Yes. The second time you mentioned Larry Fink. So Larry Fink actually says, access to capital is not a right. It's a quote in your own chapter 2. It's a privilege, and a duty to attract that capital in a responsible and sustainable way lies with you. He tells that in his letter to companies. Larry Fink was also a person that wrote letters from 2015 on, when actually Europe was working on the topic of responsible investing for already probably 10 years. But he brought it as his invention to the market. That was interesting in the first place. Second, Larry Fink was also the person that, on behalf of BlackRock, decided after the ESG backlash in the US to not be involved in the Climate Action 100+, in which they target these companies anymore. So, relating to Chapter 4, all of this, you discuss two pathways by which responsible leaders can affect organizational outcomes. The first is the psychological one. You discussed the Coca-Cola case, in which two CEOs' conviction of sustainability led to changes in the firm. And you also have this knowledge-based pathway where maybe NGOs or other stakeholders are involved to change the company. And then you got DuPont as an example. So I would restrict myself to the shareholders impacting these pathways. So maybe in the second example. So in this context, latently maybe, but sometimes even visibly, shareholders have a big say in the direction that a company has, and even in the way that the CEOs writes letters. We already discussed that a bit, that it is endogenous. But how, in your opinion then, does the ownership of the firm, so the shareholder base, whether it's, for instance, Anglo-Saxon shareholders versus European shareholders, or whether it's family-owned, take Walmart, versus dispersed ownership, whether pension funds, asset owners are holding the firm or others, how does that constrain or maybe strengthen a CEO's ability to be a responsible leader?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your two questions. Let me first get back to Chapter 4, where we describe these two pathways. I say describe because we do not test them empirically, but they basically contain two trickle-down effects, how a responsible leader, how a responsible CEO could impact his or her organization to then take up more social, more environmental initiatives. And that's the psychological pathway, but also the knowledge-based pathway. But this also, when we get back to how shareholders could influence these pathways, they also have a means to do knowledge-based or a psychological by exerting certain.
Briefly finish your question.
By impacting the how the CEO pans out with his responsibility. So they could moderate, but I would have to speculate if it strengthens the effect or weakens it.
Okay, thank you.
Laura Kirsch, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
Please, all right.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. I know what's on the line. I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got. Go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. What's on the line? I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Dear Laura Kirsch, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Gijselaars is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite you, your supervisor, to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Laura Antonia Kirsch, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. And this is also a photo moment. Laura, congratulations.
Dear Laura, dear Dr. Kirsch, doesn't that sound good? Here we are to celebrate your big day. You have achieved the highest academic degree, a PhD, a milestone that you can be immensely proud of. It serves as your entry ticket to an academic career, if you choose to pursue it, but we heard yesterday that you will, so congratulations with it. And it's also a prestigious title in the corporate world if you would choose to do so, or a combination of both. Congratulations to you, your family, and also your little son, who can be very proud of his mom. This is a very special moment. But how did this journey begin? I looked back through my email archives and found your very first message to Wim and me, dated on Wednesday, April 18, 2019. You wrote, "Dear Ms. van Stralen and dear Mr. Gijselaars, I recently came across your research team, Culture, Ethics and Leadership at the University of Maastricht and was immediately thrilled. As I'm currently searching for a professor to supervise my PhD in the area of responsible leadership, a global and ethics-driven approach to leadership, I was wondering if it would be possible to conduct my PhD within your research team. I think my aspired topic would fit very well with your research team, and I hope that I convince you as well." And you surely convinced us. In this first email, you were also very clear about your motivation for pursuing a PhD in the field of responsible leadership. You wrote, "My PhD theme is inspired and derived from my work experience at a global company, which made me realize how important sustainable leadership approaches are, both in a qualitative, for example, employee satisfaction, innovative capacity, and a quantitative way, for example, productivity, turnover. Hence, I would very much like to dive into this topic more thoroughly in my PhD thesis. My business contacts will hopefully enable an empiric study. It is my understanding that your research team acknowledges the reborn importance of culture and ethics in the aftermath of the financial crisis and corporate scandals, explores their outcomes on corporations in an interdisciplinary setting, and partners with other academic institutions and the business world. In my opinion, it would be very fruitful to write my PhD in such a conducive setting." So this already showed how thorough Laura was. And so this is how it all began. Wim and I arranged an initial online meeting with you where you shared more about your ideas. We asked you to develop a PhD proposal so we could assess the potential of your research plans. 3 months later, you presented your first proposal. Knowing the reputation of German students for being well prepared in class and meetings, I had high expectations, yet you exceeded them and truly impressed us. You didn't just come prepared, you stood out with an exceptionally organized and engaging slide deck that clearly outlined your ideas. Wim and I had no doubts. We knew we wanted to work with you and supervise your PhD. Based on our feedback, you fine-tuned your proposal and presented it at your first brown bag session in November. Looking back at the slide deck from that presentation, it's remarkable how closely it resembles the final product you presented today. This is quite unique and further shows that you had a very clear vision and confidence in your research direction right from the beginning. Given the multidisciplinary nature of your project, Wim and I decided to invite a third supervisor with expertise in leadership to join the supervision team and support you in executing your research ideas. Initially, this was Marielle Heltjes, but due to her very busy schedule, we were fortunate that Boris Lokshin agreed to step in. And Wim and I couldn't have made a better choice than involving Boris, whose guidance and insights were invaluable throughout this journey. And I would really like to take this opportunity to sincerely thank Boris for his dedication and support during this process. I also want to extend my gratitude to Wim for embarking on this PhD journey with me and for helping bring this to a successful completion. With 3 supervisors on board, each of us will also have a chance to share a few words, so I will keep it short now. Dear Laura, taking on an external PhD student is always a bit of a gamble. Sometimes it succeeds, but often it doesn't. You have truly defied the odds. This success is entirely a reflection of your character, your dedication, your hard work, and your deep motivation to learn about leadership, informed by your professional experiences and exposures to different leadership styles. Now that your PhD journey has come to an end, you're about to begin a new chapter in your life. My hope is that the insights that you've gained into responsible leadership will prove valuable for you in your career, and that your research will resonate with boards of directors, given its significance for the corporate world. And on a personal note, I'm incredibly proud of you and everything that you have achieved, and I wish you happiness and success in all your future endeavors. And with this, I will give the mic to Boris.
Thank you, Anne. Dear Laura, today you received a Doctor of Philosophy degree from Maastricht University School of Business and Economics. SB has 3 prestigious accreditations, resulting in what is known as Triple Crown accreditation. Inspired by this Triple Crown, I would like to highlight a triple P that reflect your character. The first P is for persistence. To explain persistence, I need to go back to the fall of 2018. Yes. So I was conducting 2 seminars in advanced methods course back then, and you were one of the students taking the course. So I like to chat with the students about their research, talk about my research projects, and I remember sharing with the students about how for one of the projects I collected and content analyzed letters to the shareholders of the leading corporations around the world. So a few months later I received an email from you in which you reminded me about taking the seminar and asked if I could share with you my data. Back then, I didn't know what to think of that request, so I didn't respond. But 2 months later, you sent another email asking if I could send you the collected shareholders' letters. So in late January, you sent a third email saying you're now in Maastricht, and you thought it would be great to have a meeting. And so 3 times the strike. It was difficult to ignore such persistency, and this is when in February 2020 we found ourselves in Wim's office around one table, Anne, Wim, myself, Jo, exchanging ideas about your research question and possible content analysis approaches to analyze the letters. That was a start of a great collaboration. The second P is for perseverance. Even with an office at the university and collegial support and regular face-to-face access to your supervisors, a full-time PhD training is often described as a very lonely journey. In the time of Corona, you did not have any of those luxuries. What made your journey successful, being a part-time doctoral researcher, was that you excelled in finding your productive space, structure, and deadlines. So working from home can be difficult because there are distractions, and it's hard moving from family mode to work mode. You perfected the use of digital calendar and scheduling. Our meetings twice a month were scheduled a year in advance, making sure the best possible slot that brings all 3 supervisors together was booked before anybody else could grab it. So time frames for completing the tasks were worked out and reporting deadlines were strictly observed. You would send us a week before an elaborate report about things you have done, issues that need discussion, and decisions to be taken. After each meeting, decision points were meticulously summarized. Naeem was born in October 2021 and brought lots of joy to you, your family, but also a need to rediscover a routine, a new routine. So my deep respect goes for your perseverance, for staying on this PhD track and finding that elusive balance between work, family, and yourself. The third P is for patience. Unlike your doctoral journey, your research journey does not end today. The first chapter of your dissertation after revision has been resubmitted to a journal, and your second chapter has recently received revise and resubmit decision from a very respectable leadership journal. Seeing all this tremendous work you have done in print takes additional to perseverance and persistent a lot of patience. In my mind, these 3 Ps were instrumental for you to achieve your personal crown today. So congratulations, Laura, and your family with this special moment. And I pass the mic to him.
Ja, dear Laura, liebe Frau Dr. Laura Kirsch, das klingt schon besser, nicht? As the third supervisor in line, I just want to say 3 things because I want to keep it short. So, first of all, I agree with all the praise you received from Anne and Boris. And I also want to extend this praise by saying how proud I am as well about your achievement for today and what you did with producing your PhD manuscript. So third is I want to keep it short. And what I want to say is I was deeply impressed by the way you managed us. Like Boris said, you know, it takes quite a skill to bring us together at the right moment. You were there. I was deeply impressed by your persistence on how you approach a very fundamental and very relevant question to the field, knowing its multidisciplinarity by nature, bringing all the complexity you face, and the things which was also reflected in the questions you got today. And I think you, the best advice I can give you is please continue your work in this field. Keep convincing the people like us, throwing all the difficult questions to you, but then do it the way you have been doing so far. So I wish you, your family, Zaf and Naeem, all the best. And I do hope that they will continue giving you the support they gave you so far. And I wish you all the best with your work. Thank you very much.
Dear Dr. Kirsch, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with this degree that you have acquired. It was a very nice defense to be part of. So I'm about to close this academic session after we have closed it, I would like you to wait here with the committee and also with the paranymph, perhaps also the family, because there will be 2 photo moments. We will do 1 photo moment over here, because then also the external candidates will be in the picture. And the second picture will be outside on the stairs, well, inside, but on the stairs inside. And I would like to ask the rest of the audience already to go to the reception in the rafter and then await our presence there. I hereby close this academic session.